A century ago, 1.5 million of us worked as servants. Astonishingly, that's more than worked in industries or on the land. My great-grandmothers were servants, and coming from this background, I want to find out about the reality of their lives. Country houses like these simply wouldn't have been able to function without a whole army of staff working away above and below stairs. When I come to places like this, my first instinct isn't to go through the grand formal entrance, but to find the servants' door and go in that way. In this series, I want to dispel the nostalgia and fantasies that we have around domestic service and reveal a much more complex world. I'm going to tell a very different sort of history, one of suppressed passions, strict hierarchies, and an obsession with status and class. Digging through the archives, I'll track down the lost lives of real servants, whose voices have largely been forgotten. Who's this?
Me. I wasn't bad looking, were I?
Yeah, you were. Very good looking.
We were underdogs. We weren't on the same level as them. And we had to know our place.
I'll visit the homes of the super-rich and the anxious middle classes in order to understand how servants actually lived and worked. But above all, I want to ask some difficult questions that have been left unanswered for decades.
Amazing, isn't it?
Our country was based on an ideal around service for so long. Why was that? Why did that world disappear? And what uncomfortable truths can we uncover by looking at the reality of servants' lives? Between the mid-18th and mid-19th century, grand country houses sprung up all over Britain. New wealth from the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution transformed feudal homes into the grand estates of a new ruling class. One of these was Erddig Hall in North Wales. Erddig was home to local landowners, the Yorks, and their staff, 30 outdoor estate workers, plus 15 indoor servants. In the servants' quarters, the first thing you see is a poem blessing them all. May heaven protect our home from flame, or hurt or harm of various name, and may no evil luck betide to any who therein abide, or who from homes beyond its gate bestow their toil on this estate. And toil's the word. The hall was built on a generous scale, 200,000 square feet of house, with 6 formal reception rooms, a chapel, a grand dining room, and 9 family bedrooms. In order to service these rooms, there were twice as many rooms downstairs and in the outhouses, each with their own specific function, from the kitchen and the scullery to the laundry and the bakehouse. The family upstairs could summon the servants to any part of the house at any time. Erddig might seem quiet now, but in its prime, the economic scale of the work that kept it going was staggering. Every week, 3 tons of coal were carried around to fuel 51 fireplaces, 5 ovens and 3 coppers. 200 to 300 gallons of water were carted around different parts of the house for cooking, cleaning and washing. And for washing, we're talking up to 600 items per week. Then there's the food. 4 meals a day for up to 30 people. That would be the family and their staff, guests and their staff. And all this was done by hand by a small army of servants working 17-hour days all year round, with no modern technology. This scale of service was repeated in country houses across the British Isles. But what's so unusual about Erddig is that the family had a long-standing tradition of having portraits made of their servants. This is the family of servants at Erddig in 1852. Family of servants at the front, the real family at the back in that window there. Each servant is depicted carrying an implement or a tool relating to their role in the house. And historians call these loyalty portraits. You find them up and down the country in servant-keeping houses. We've got the butler with his bottle, the housekeeper with a brace of fowl, the lady's maid with her sewing kit. What's particularly nice about this one is that the employers wrote poems to go with the portraits. Here's what they say about the butler. Our butler in the foreground shown as Thomas Murray well was known, he who does nigh centre stand with bottle clasp within his hand. Clever was he at drawing cork, and a good hand at knife and fork. And I really like this one about the lady's maid. They don't seem to like her so much. Nearby our butler, Mrs. Hale, of whom our memories much do fail. As lady's maid she sojourned here, black was her dress, her face austere. And whence she did for Brighton leave, no one here a sigh did heave. Oh dear. The photograph and the poem give us a revealing glimpse into life below stairs. They hint at the tension between the staff themselves, whose lives were governed by a strict hierarchy. In houses like Erddig, the butler was at the top of the pile, overseeing the coachman and footman. He was in overall charge of the house, alongside the housekeeper, who hired the housemaids. The cook dominated a separate world, controlling kitchen maids to prepare food, dairy maids to make butter and cheese, and scullery maids for the washing up. The governess and head nurse took care of the children's universe, while the lady's maid and valet, close to their mistresses and masters, stood separate from the other servants. And at the very bottom of the pile were the laundry maids and hall boys. The hall boy usually slept in the servants' dining hall on a fold-out bed. Sadly, we don't know much about the hall boy at Erddig in the 1850s, a lad called Edward Davis. But hall boys in other houses did record their 16-hour days in gruelling detail. The hall boy at Longleat was a lad called Gordon Grimmett, and he wrote in his memoirs that every day he had to trim, clean and fill all the lamps and candles in the house, and that could be up to 300. And every morning, before the other servants even woke up, he had to polish 60 pairs of staff boots. Every servant acquired a very specific set of skills, learning from senior servants or from household manuals.
How to clean ladies' boots. The following is an excellent polish for applying to ladies' boots. Mix equal portions of sweet oil, vinegar and treacle with 1 ounce of lampblack. When all the ingredients are thoroughly incorporated, rub the mixture onto the boots with the palm of the hand and put them in a cool place to dry.
The pecking order was even played out when the servants ate their meals together in the servants' hall.
Mealtimes were a time when the status, the hierarchies between servants were enforced. There would be a strict order of coming in to eat and strict rules about where different ranks of servants might sit. And you might also have rules such as no speaking unless you were addressed by one of the senior servants. And the senior servants had a great deal of power, so the butler, for example, in some households would put down his knife and fork and everyone else had to finish eating, whether you'd finished or not. So servants had to learn to be fast eaters.
Some houses had a strict set of rules governing behaviour in the hall. You even had to pay a forfeit if you broke them. For instance, Rule 4, that if any person be heard to swear or use any indecent language at any time when the cloth is on the table, he is to forfeit 3d. Rule 7, whoever leaves any pieces of bread at breakfast, dinner or supper forfeits 1 penny.
But there was also divisions between the different branches of domestic service. So famously, cooks were often very protective of their space. And the kitchen staff sometimes wouldn't eat here in the servants' hall, but had the privilege of being able to eat in the kitchen. And the other servants always suspected that they had better food.
And of course, I imagine some servants had to serve the other servants.
That's right. You would have had the very junior servants learning their trade, if you like, by serving in the servants' hall.
Way above the hall boy, the most powerful female servant at Erddig was the housekeeper, and her room is still immaculately preserved. From here, she did the accounts and tradesmen's orders, marshalled the female staff, and looked after the most precious items, such as the china and the linen. In 1852, the housekeeper here was Mrs. Webster. One of the most iconic objects associated with a housekeeper were her keys. And here's Mrs. Webster, a housekeeper at Erddig, with her keys in her lap. In fact, it was said that it was a mark of a good housekeeper that she could strike fear into the hearts of the lower servants with a mere jangle of the keys. Mrs. Webster didn't just look the part. Her employer's poem paints her as the perfect frugal employee who rose through the ranks. Upon the portly form we look of one who was our former cook. No better keeper of our store did ever enter at our door. She knew and pandered to our taste, allowed no want and yet no waste. And for some 30 years or more, the cares of office here she bore. Although Erddig's loyalty portraits and poems suggest a coziness between masters and servants, the reality is starkly different. Most big houses were specifically designed to keep the masters and their servants apart. One of the best examples of this idea of separation is Petworth. Its Sussex estate was 15 times larger than Erddig, and at its height it employed 300 indoor and outdoor staff. Most of the indoor staff lived and worked in a separate servants' wing at the back of the main house, but that wasn't enough. In order to keep the servants actually hidden from their employers and guests, the architect designed a tunnel which connects the servants' wing to the main house. Low-ceilinged and damp, you can just imagine what it was like with dozens of servants brushing past each other, carrying trays of food and dirty dishes. You can think of the country house rather like a giant swan, gliding gracefully on the surface, but underneath there's an army of servants paddling furiously to keep the whole thing moving. It tells us a lot about the reality of servants' lives. Most big employers didn't know their servants by name. Some didn't know how many they had. In one house in Suffolk, if a junior member of staff came into contact with a member of the family, they actually had to flatten themselves against the wall. Anonymity and invisibility were a very big part of the job. As if a tunnel wasn't enough, the main house itself was designed for invisibility, with its hidden passages, secret doors and backstairs, allowing the servants to shadow their employers' every move. From here, a hidden army could service their master's needs with invisible hands, turning up beds, lighting fires, filling their baths and jugs with water brought up from the range. Scuff marks of slop buckets. The contrast between the sumptuous, richly decorated family areas and the dull-coloured servant quarters is stark. The very top floor of the house wasn't only designed to keep servants away from their employers, it was also built to keep servants separate from each other. Up here in the attic is where the senior servants slept, the butler, the housekeeper, the valet, the ladies' maids. The lower servants slept in dormitories above the servants' wing, men up one end, women down the other, separated by a locked door. In fact, I think you've got to think of this house as a physical embodiment of 19th century values with separation and segregation at its heart. It's segregation by sex, by skill, by age, and of course, in a house like this, by class. Here, in Petworth's vast private archive, with records dating back 700 years, we see what this segregation actually meant for the servants. A huge difference in pay between the highest and the lowest.
Which is quite fun.
Yes. Here we've got payments for servants and servants' wages.
And these are the servants in 1860. Yeah. They more or less go in hierarchical order. We're starting with Henry Upton, who was the surveyor.
£50 a quarter is roughly £14,500 a year today. He is by far the highest earner.
And so we go on down through the housemaids, the kitchen maids, and probably somewhere at the bottom, though they don't tell us, are the laundry maids. People like Christine Anderson, who only gets 3 guineas a year.
just £700 a year in today's money. Though you have to remember that the staff here were fed, provided with uniforms, and lived rent-free. Surprisingly, in spite of the master-servant segregation, the archives have a very rare book, an informal photo album compiled by the master's daughter-in-law. All the dear servants at Petworth from 1860.
Yes, this was collected by Mrs. Percy Wyndham. She'd had photographs taken of all her favourite servants here.
Regardless of the house design, Mrs. Wyndham clearly got to know the servants and wrote affectionate notes, giving us tiny hints of their lives.
And this is Thomas, who was maid to Mrs. Percy Wyndham, who married Owen, the valet.
Thomas is presumably her surname?
Yes.
Oh, OK.
This is dear old Bowler, the nursemaid. A butler or under butler, name forgot.
Name forgot.
Would have Petworth, but not for very long.
Still got a photograph, though.
Yes. There's Mr. Upton, the clerk of works, who we know got £50 a year from the wage book. A dairymaid, Mrs. Greenfield. A laundry maid, Reynolds, who's John Dine, who's butler for a long time. They didn't really want him to be butler. They didn't think he was quite up to it because he was so nervous.
Oh, dear.
And if you brought them a cup of coffee in the morning, his hand would shake so much that he wouldn't have much coffee left in the cup. But he stayed with them for years.
So they kept him on anyway?
Yes, yes.
It's quite tantalising because you get a sense of, you know, who they are from here, where they worked, what they looked like, but there's still so much more, I think.
Yes, you'd like to ask them what they thought of it.
Yes. The formal servant portraits in this album, most standing proud in their uniform, are very familiar to us. And yet, these uniforms were actually a Victorian invention. 100 years earlier, in the 18th century, servants had dressed much more individually. This is a wonderful collection of portraits. They look like lords and ladies in the latest fashions. In fact, they're all servants. Up here is Mary Hayes, down here is Mary Wells. They're both housemaids. Look at them, beautifully dressed. Look at their bonnets and their beautiful lace collars. This is another lovely one. This is the housekeeper, Mrs. Edwards. Looks more like Marie Antoinette in that powdered wig. The men servants also really well turned out. This is a lower groom, Francis Yates, but look at his orange silk waistcoat there. Up here we've got the gardener and his wife, beautiful bonnet and roses, beautiful silver buttons down his jacket. This is Stevens, who is a general manservant, but if we take him off the wall, have a look at the back, get some lovely detail on him. Stevens, alias Lumpy, the famous player at cricket. So I think he was the Duke's cricket coach, and no doubt about why he was hired. When you think about them as a group, what really comes across is their personality, individuality, with their own looks and style. The most fashionable couple of all, placed in the very centre, look like they are the master and mistress, but they too are servants. If you compare these 18th century portraits with 19th century photographs, there's one very clear difference: uniforms. This is a mid-19th century photograph of a servant staff at a country house, and they're all in uniforms, different uniforms for different ranks, for different purposes, very clear division of labour, very clear what people do, because you can read it from their dress. It's even more pronounced in this one. This group of maidservants from the early 20th century, they've not only got the same clothes, they've even got the same hair. This lovely roll at the front. Some can clearly carry it off better than others, I think. What is happening here? Clothing is serving a purpose. Clothing is denoting class, it's putting servants back in their place. It's almost like individual identities are being flattened to a type. And this even happen with names. Fancy or higher ranking names could be changed by employers to more suitable lower ranking names. So Florence could become Flo, Elizabeth could become Betty. And in some houses, footmen were given the names Henry or William, regardless of what their actual names were. As the 19th century progressed, service became more sharply defined as a profession, with specific uniforms and dress codes, as well as particular rules and customs. Tracts and manuals spelt out these rules clearly. How to be a Victorian servant. This is a 19th century pamphlet. Very snappy title for servants. Hints to domestic servants, addressed more particularly to male and female servants connected with the nobility, gentry and clergy. And it's written by a butler in a gentleman's family, 1854. So note, he's not a master, he's a butler, and this is his view of how servants should behave. Page 74, cleanliness. The first thing I would recommend is cleanliness. No person will make a good servant who is not habitually clean in person and in work. Nothing is more offensive to a lady or gentleman than to have a dirty, slovenly servant about them, male or female. Page 78. Be uniformly obedient to your masters. Page 81. A slothful servant is a wicked servant. Keep your master's secret. Never reveal what he intends should be private. Defend your master's honour and the honour of his house. Seize on every opportunity to promote their happiness, and especially by praying for the renewing grace of God. Service, with its particular codes of behaviour and dress, became ever more sharply defined as the riches extracted from the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution flooded into cities like Liverpool, Manchester and London. This wealth fuelled a massive building boom, giving rise to the terraced houses with attics and basements of the newly emerging Victorian middle classes. And one way these new middle classes felt they could cement their status was by keeping servants. One such servant, William Taylor, gives us a rare personal view inside these middle-class households. William was manservant to a wealthy widow on Great Cumberland Street in London. Back in the 1830s, this was a very smart row of houses. The fact that it's a hotel now with its own doorman is really quite apt in a way. William Taylor had grown up on a small farm and came to London to look for work. He wrote a diary which is incredibly revealing of servant life in the bustling social city. And remarkably, it survived.
May the 14th. Mechanics and tradespeople speak disrespectfully of servants. If they meet a servant in company, they will say, one to the other, "It's only a servant." But everyone must know that servants form one of the most respectable classes of person that is in existence. They must be healthy, clean, honest, a sober set of people. May the 18th. We're going to have a party this evening, something larger than usual. It is quite disgusting to modest eyes to see how the young ladies dress, nearly naked to the waist to attract the gentlemen, naked on the breast except to cover the nipples. If anyone wants to see all the ways of the world, they must be a gentleman's servant.
Amazingly, William Taylor's diary and his scrapbook have been handed down through 4 generations of his family and are now treasured by his great-great-great-niece. And here is the diary. Do we know why he wrote the diary?
Yes, he says so. He says he wanted to practice his writing. As I am a wretched bad writer, many of my friends have advised me to practice.
So he writes this diary, and it's a year in his life, 1837.
Yes.
What are his duties?
Cleaning the lamps and the shoes, and the knives, because you didn't have stainless steel knives in those days. Mm-hmm. And then he would be taking the meals up and clearing them away, and he appears to have done the washing up from upstairs, which you might think the maidservants would do. But
of course, he was married, wasn't he, William?
Yes, he was. It was unusual for servants to be married at that time.
And where are the wife and child, then?
Living in respectable lodgings round the corner.
But he also kept a scrapbook, and I think he was something of an artist. Is that right?
Yes, yes. He made a scrapbook to send home to his family for their entertainment.
And is this it here?
This is it, yes. It's a bit fragile.
Yes.
It's obviously been much looked at.
Yes.
A book of entertainment composed of drawings, scraps, memorandums by William W. Taylor. All the drawings in this book that are marked WT are drawn by William Taylor, self-taught artist.
That's his frontispiece. He's got a lovely picture here of a lion and a tiger. But he also gives us an insight into his life in service, I think, in some of these pictures.
Yes, carefully. Yeah. I like the way the carpet is so carefully done.
The servants helping themselves behind the screen in the dining room. And the master and mistress having
I like
dinner.
the one having a swig from the bottle.
The one's having a swig from the bottom, one's eating one of the sweetmeats.
Yes.
Just before they bring them in, you imagine.
Yes.
Yes. We've got the master, the mistress. It's fantastic. I do wonder what his family made of him when he went home on visits.
But there is one picture of him going home.
William Taylor going home and alarming his friends.
Him arriving, dressed quite smartly.
This is Mr. T. Buttoned trousers there and his
Gaiters.
top hat, gaiters, yes. Hands in his pockets.
Smart coat.
Yes.
His Uncle James, very much alarmed. Notice he's still wearing a smock.
Yes, and he is very much alarmed with the eyes. Yeah. That's great. There are two passages here that I think really sum up William Taylor's life in service. The first one is from one of his days off in March. And he says, I made to town on the omnibus, got there by 5 o'clock, went to see a friend, came to Cumberland Street at 7, went to the Opera House at 8, to see and hear a lecture on astronomy. The man showed us how the world turned around and how fast it goes. We turned round at the rate of 17 miles a minute. We saw how the eclipse took place. He showed us everything belonging to the sun, moon and stars. So he's really seeing life, the world, the universe, as a result of his life in service. But at the end of the diary, it strikes a much more melancholic note. 30th of December. Have been very busy and at home all day. The life of a gentleman's servant is something like that of a bird shut up in a cage. The bird is well housed and well fed, but is deprived of liberty, and liberty is the dearest and sweetest object of all Englishmen. And it's really interesting that he talks about liberty, because a lot of other kinds of workers, working men, were beginning to talk about liberty at that time after the French Revolution, and you kind of don't expect to hear a servant talking about it. In London, men servants has to sleep downstairs underground, which is generally very damp. So he's been to a lecture about the stars, but he has to sleep back down on the ground, underground even. Many men lose their lives by it, by this damp, or otherwise get eaten up with rheumatics. One might see fine, blooming young men come from the country, like himself, to take service, but after they have been in London 1 year, all the bloom is lost and a pale yellow, sickly complexion in its stead. At the very end of the diary, 31st of December, he says, now all the readers of this book might gain an idea of what service is. So here's a diary that started off as an exercise to improve William's handwriting, but it ended up being much, much more than that. In fact, it ended up being one of the most rare and most moving records of service that we've got. As the middle class expanded, so did their voracious demand for staff. By 1851, an astonishing 1.3 million people were servants. Keeping a servant was a badge of respectability. It marked your status as a member of the middle class. In 1859, a woman wrote a letter to Charles Dickens' journal All Year Round. In it, she says, I am the wife of an assistant surgeon. My husband has the entire charge of a branch practice with a salary of £80 a year. We are expected to keep up a genteel appearance. The clergyman and his wife, our rich neighbour and his wife, and a few of the gentry call on us occasionally. I must not do our household work or carry my baby out, or I should lose caste. We must keep a servant. But the new mistresses had no experience of how to keep a servant, so they looked to the aristocracy, with their centuries' experience of servant keeping. 18 Stafford Terrace in Kensington was the home of Punch cartoonist Linley Sambourne and his wife Marion, and is a perfect example of how aristocratic ideals of the big house played out amongst the new middle classes. The house is a remarkable time capsule, stuffed full of things and people. Linley and Marion Sambourne, their 2 children, Linley's mother, but also 5 servants, a cook, a parlourmaid, a housemaid, a nurse, and even a groom, the only one reporting directly to the master. What's striking about these houses is that they're very narrow. There's only one staircase here, no back staircase. So the geography of the house is very different to that of the big house, but styles of service are really similar. And I think what's happening here is that the middle classes are using their new money to buy into old values. What's really central to those old values is the idea of separation. So here we have the servants pushed into the attic or down in the basement, illusions of space created by doors, by curtains, by speaking tubes, and of course those bells. But the irony is that everyone in this house is within calling distance of each other. Marion Sambourne kept meticulous diaries and accounts, as well as advice manuals. The fattest and most famous of all is Mrs. Beeton's book of household management.
It's not just recipes, it's full of information about how to run the household, and of course she's well known for this quote at the beginning. As with the commander of an army, or the leader of an enterprise, so it is with the mistress of a house. Her spirit will be seen through the whole establishment, and just in proportion as she performs her duties intelligently and thoroughly, so will her domestics follow in her path.
And for me, what's lovely about these diaries, although they're Marion's diaries, the mistress's diaries, we do get a sense of the servants' lives. We get a little window on their world, would you say?
Yes, definitely. It does seem from the diaries that Marion was quite a good mistress. Well, in this diary, for instance, she's obviously having a lot of trouble with cook. She had a cook who was left, and she's been trying out various other cooks, and they're all very unsatisfactory, particularly this one, Mrs. T, who obviously overspends, because not only are the books very heavy, but Mrs. T drinks an awful lot of beer. Generally, that was one of cook's perks. You provided free beer, and you'd have a little barrel in the kitchen for cook to help herself.
Quite thirsty work.
Well, it was. I mean, you were literally slaving over a hot stove. Saw Mrs. T about beer. 29 gallons went in a fortnight. She either sold it on or she entertained her friends. So after that, new arrangements were made. And on the 10th, Mrs. T gave notice, underlined.
As Punch cartoonist, the master of the house needed photo models as the basis of his sketches, using not just himself, but the family servants, and above all, his groom, Otley.
Here we have some of the photographs which show what fun Linley and Otley had together. We've got thousands of pictures of Otley, literally thousands, and this is one of my favourites because he's dressed up as the Emperor Nero and he's fiddling while Rome burns, you see. He's twanging a harp, which is actually a fire screen.
Otley reported directly to his master, who wasn't nearly as strict as Marion. Otley clearly never worked as hard as the maids. Marion's home, like many mistresses of her status, was full of new furnishings. Rugs, wallpaper, ceramics, glassware, mahogany, from the new industries and across the empire. Marion put her housemaids to work, keeping all these objects in pristine condition. This is Marion Sambourne's household rota. It's a to-do list, really, for her servants. This is what she wants the housemaid to do. 7 o'clock, bring in my hot drinking water. Sweep down, thoroughly clean the stairs, get the bathroom ready and lavatory, and then the servant has her breakfast. 8 o'clock, bring my hot water. Draw up blinds empty and take away bath. Always use basin cloth and wipe tumblers. 8:30. Clean grate in drawing room, thoroughly sweep and dust room. Wipe round parquet, clean all brass. A lot of brass in here as well. Open windows front and back. Water and wipe with a wet cloth all plants. A lot of plants in here.
How to clean a looking glass. Blow the dust off the gilt frame, as the least grit would scratch the surface of the glass. First sponge it with a little spirits of wine, or gin and water, so as to remove all spots. Then dust the glass over with the powder blue, tied in muslin, rubbing it lightly and quickly off, and polishing with the silk handkerchief.
And what you'll see here is that every minute is accounted for. Taking us through to the evening, 7 o'clock we find her tidying the drawing room where we're sitting now. Put the cushions tidy and tidy the papers, dust tables and the piano. See to the lights and sweep the fires. 8 o'clock, assist and wait at table, and after see to bedrooms. Turn down beds, washstands wiped, hot water, chambers and so on. 9 o'clock she has her own supper in the kitchen. 10 o'clock she can fall into bed, and that's the end of her day, until of course she gets up and does it all again the next day. Now that sounds like a day from hell for me, but I guess this is the housemaid's lot. Just reading that out gives me a real sense of the control that's going on here, that the servants, every minute is accounted for, nothing's left to chance, every detail is covered. It also gives you a sense of the sheer scale of the work. It's boring, it's repetitive, it's demanding, and ultimately I think it's pretty lonely as well. You'd think the housemaid would get some privacy up here, finally asleep in her own bed. But Linley Sanborn clearly thought it was fine for him to take one of his photos of her, looking utterly exhausted. The servants certainly had a tough life, but the mistresses weren't happy either. It was challenging for both sides, living so closely alongside each other. This closeness bred anxiety, with mistresses worrying about what the servants were really up to. So much so that their paranoia was even sent up in a book. This is called The Greatest Plague of Life, or The Adventures of a Lady in Search of a Good Servant. And it's full of wonderful illustrations, graphic illustrations of servants behaving badly. So here, the nurse taking the baby out for a walk in the park, but baby's fallen out of the pram. She's not noticed because she's chatting to a gentleman follower. One here with the servants sitting down in the kitchen having a chat, bells ringing up above them. They just say, oh, just let them ring again. So they're not going to get up for anybody. I think one of the most telling is this one. The mistress has gone out. She's come back in. She's found the servants not downstairs working, upstairs partying in her drawing room. This is an important one because it shows this is the world turned upside down. And what happens when the order is overturned? Chaos ensues. This one I love. Here's the mistress in the centre of a totally chaotic scene. Baby on the floor, mirror being cracked, somebody swigging the wine. Now, OK, these are cartoons, they're satire, they're meant for a joke. But they do tell us an awful lot about the neuroses, fears and anxieties of this new servant-keeping class. The Greatest Plague of Life was such a bestseller that it was turned into a magic lantern slideshow for the entertainment of both the servants and their anxious employers. And how did they prevent such bad behaviour? By attempting to control not just the outward manners, but also the inner morals of their servants. Thank you very much. Where better than every Sunday at church? Religion reminded everyone of their place. The Christians were all servants of God. Real servants had time off to come to church. It was quite a strict seating hierarchy. Masters and mistresses would be at the front in their finest clothes. Servants would be behind them, much more modestly dressed. Mustn't outdo the mistress. The message conveyed, through seating arrangements, but even more directly from the pulpit, was about accepting one's station in life. Can you tell me about the importance of Christianity to Victorian society, the 19th century?
I mean, the thing I think that's hard for us to remember is that in the 1840s, 50s and 60s, Britain is a Christian nation and is becoming a very convinced Christian society. The home and the family becomes much more important, and the role of the mistress and master in relation to their servants is a huge part of that, and part of that moral transformation of the nation. What you do in your home, how you educate your children and your servants, this is where, as it were, the moral regeneration of the nation can begin.
So what this seems to be telling us is that there's a much bigger picture here about service. Service isn't just about the domestic work, the cooking and the cleaning and the washing, and all important as those things are. There's a moral side to it as well, would you say?
Absolutely.
So would it be a mistake to think that servants are somehow passive in all of this, and this is all coming from the top down?
Well, I think it's a complete mistake to think that, because for one thing, it means that people are just dupes and rather foolish, sort of absorbing the views of their betters. Many servants were rural migrants, and many of them would have grown up in villages where they went to church on a Sunday and they heard the rector or the vicar telling them about their station in life and telling them that the best thing they can do to serve God is to do good and honourable work. And that's the station to which they're called.
What's the darker side to all this?
For me, service is almost entirely a darker side, and I'm trying to give you a sense of its idealism, but in reality, it's not a mechanism for social mobility. You know, your average kitchen maid or groom, you know, they don't move up the scale, they don't get richer, they remain in their place.
As the wealth of the country continued to grow, a new category of people wanted to join the ranks of servant keepers, the lower middle class. Most of them could afford just one servant, the kind who is largely ignored by history, but who came to dominate domestic service, the maid of all work. If you look in the 1871 census, you see that 2/3 of all servants fell into this category. And if you want an idea of what their lives were like, you can turn to Mrs. Beeton. She said, "The general servant, or maid of all work, is perhaps the only one of her class deserving of commiseration. Her life is a solitary one, and in some places, her work is never done." In the maid of all work, all the different branches of domestic service were combined into one, leaving her with an endless list of daily duties, as outlined in instruction manuals and how-to books.
Brush up the range, light the fire, scrub the kitchen floor, sweep the dust hall, the furniture, shake the mat, polish the brass, scrub the doorstep, clean the boots, strip the beds, empty the slops, air the bedrooms, dust the paths, scrape and peel potatoes, cook the dinner, change uniform, serve at dinner, lock and bolt the doors.
24 Cheney Row, London, was home to perhaps the best documented maids of all work. Amazingly, a photographer has captured a glimpse of one of them, peeking out of the ground floor window. Today, this is a really well-to-do area, but it wasn't always like that. You think back over 100 years ago, this was not a high-end address. It's too close to the river. You've got sewage, you've got stench, you've got fog rolling up here. But what this is a typical example of a house lower down the social scale that would have employed just one servant. And she would have lived and worked down there. Two of my great-grandmothers were maids of all work, employed in houses just like this. I find it quite daunting coming down here. Wow, so this is the world of the maid of all work. It's very dark down here. It's a sunny day up there, but it still feels dark down here, and I think in the winter it'd be even darker, wouldn't it? And she's got what she needs down here. These are the tools of her trade, aren't they? The sink, range, table, even her bed's over there. She'd be working all day, she'd fall into bed at night, she'd start all over again. Feels very closed in. The maid who slept here, in this bed, would have been employed by traders or professionals, doctors, dentists, coal merchants, beer merchants, those kinds of people. In fact, my great-grandmother worked for a doctor's family just up the river in Chiswick. It's always made me feel a bit sad that we never knew what she did or how she worked, but there are other ways of getting a glimpse inside the world of the maid-of-all-work. Here's one. This is Mrs H, who remembers that she left school at 14. Her mother had found her a job at a local builder's and she had to look after 3 children. She's only 14 herself. She says, terribly homesick, cried to sleep, lived in kitchen separate from household, so very like where we're sitting now. Here's another one. This is from the Morning Chronicle in the 1850s. When I was 10, I was sent to service as a maid-of-all-work in a small tradesman's family. It was a hard place. My mistress used me very cruelly, beating me often. When I'd been in the place 3 weeks, my mother died. I stood my mistress's ill treatment for about 6 months. She beat me with sticks as well as with her hands. I was black and blue, and at last I ran away. Now, we don't know if all maids-of-all-work were treated this badly. Probably they weren't all, but as these voices tell us, some of them definitely were. I hope my great-grandmothers had a better time than that. The mistress of this household certainly didn't treat her maidservants as badly, but she did have a very complicated relationship with them. This was the home of eminent historian Thomas Carlyle and his wife Jane, also a woman of letters. She evocatively documents her daily trials and tribulations, and leaves us with an eloquent record of the bond which dominated her life, the extraordinarily fractious, challenging relationship between her and her maids-of-all-work. There are reams and reams of this stuff. Jane wrote letters nearly every day, and a lot of it is about the relationship with her servants. And although it's from the mistress's point of view yet again, we do still get more than a glimpse of the servants' lives and characters coming through. There's Isabella, who's described as a fiery Scottish maid who basically tells Jane where to go. She says, no one woman living could do my work. And when Jane says, well, actually, someone's been doing this for years, she says, well, there's some women that like to make slaves of themselves, but I will never slave myself for anybody's pleasure. And she packs her bags and off she goes. And I guess what this means for me, really, is that it shows us where power lies in this story. The power's not just with the mistress, with her power to hire and fire. The power's also with the maids, who had the power to leave, and leave they did. Jane went through 34 maids in 32 years. We simply don't know how many were sacked and how many walked. Jane was not unusual in her troubles around servant keeping. Like many Victorian middle-class mistresses, she struggled with this idea of being a manager and moral guardian, knowing that her personal reputation was based on the way her servants behaved. And something happened in this tiny back room with her maidservant Mary that put Jane's personal reputation on the line.
Well, the story that Jane tells in a letter is that a neighbour came and said, we need to tell you this because everyone in the neighbourhood knows.
Okay.
And the story she told was that the maid had given birth in this room. Jane wasn't at home, but Thomas was not only at home, Thomas was there. Thomas was a couple of feet away for at least a period while the woman was in this closet giving birth. He was having, says Jane, his after-dinner tea and sitting there. While this story reflects on the servant, the interesting thing to me is the way Jane tells the story, is how it reflects on Jane.
Yes.
Jane had failed in this duty, and I certainly read the letter to a degree that she is setting out precisely why she didn't fail, precisely to indicate to her friends and her family that she wasn't the unvigilant mistress, which would have indicated a moral failing in her. It wasn't simply that the woman giving birth had failed, but that Jane had failed to teach her the ways of middle-class righteousness.
So she's repairing herself as moral mistress.
Absolutely.
So what happened in the end to this servant?
Jane sacks her.
Most employers tried to prevent getting into such a tricky situation by encouraging their charges to read the wealth of moral literature aimed specifically at servants. In the basement of the British Library, we've unearthed some rare copies. So these are just a small selection of a vast, vast literature aimed at servants produced in the 19th century, and there's all kinds of things here. There are magazines, there are prayer books, there are fables, there are personal stories, so it's a really vast amount of stuff. How would they get this material? Well, some would be given to them by their masters or mistresses. We've got one here, a present for servants from their masters. Others would be given to them by perhaps their parents or relatives before they left for service. Others still, they might just buy themselves. There's one here, the Servants' Magazine, which I think is a commercial publication. And it's fascinating because it shows us the journey that the servant is expected to make from disordered country cottage to ordered family home where she's stoking the fire. A crucial part of that journey for her is a moral and religious teaching that helps her to make this journey. So here we've got the servant kneeling by her bed, saying her prayers, the servant maid. Though servitude's my destined lot, and I am doomed to roam, far from my native peaceful cot, far from my friends and home. If God saw fit to make me great, he would not this deny, and while I'm in a meaner state, he will my wants supply. And the message there is that servants should be happy with their position in life. God's looking after them, they're doing the right thing. There's another one here, which is a daily prayer book for servants from the 1850s. We've got prayers for a housekeeper or butler or any place in authority, and then prayers for a lady's maid, a nurse, an undermaid servant, and a manservant. There are also specific prayers on specific themes, and just listen to these themes. Humility, meekness, contentment, honesty, truthfulness. It's the one about contentment that really gets me. For contentment. Almighty Father, who alone art wise, yea, wisdom itself, make me to feel that in thy providence thou orderest all things for the best, and grant that I may be able to be satisfied with the station in which thou hast placed me, not envying those who are richer and higher than I, but content to be poor and lonely in this world. And I think that says it all. To see one of the most telling examples of the ideal, loyal and moral Victorian servant, I'm going back to Erddig. Miss Harriet Rogers worked her way up from housemaid to housekeeper over an impressive 40 years, and her portrait has earned its place in the servant wing corridor. What's really striking about Harriet is that she devoted her whole life to service. She climbed to the top of the career ladder. And this is how her poem ends. Then, with her lifelong task complete, did Harriet Rogers seek retreat, and found it in our neighbouring town amid the kindred of her own. May all such years as yet remain be peaceful and unspoilt by pain, and at the last may heaven accord her faithful work its blessed reward. If anyone deserves her loyalty portrait, it's Harriet. Harriet's letters and personal possessions still survive. In a house near Stockport, a number of objects associated with Harriet, a picture of her father, Erddig carpenter Thomas Rogers, a painting of Erddig, and a room full of memorabilia are treasured by her great-great-niece.
Her letter in 1846.
This looks like almost a shrine to a life in service. We've got her diary, we've got her cookbooks, the instruction manual, her prayer books, the workbook, the lamp. So it's got her initials here.
Yes.
HR stamped there. And she would have used this in the halls of Erddig.
Yes. Yes, it has a spare candle holder.
Spare candle in there.
And wax matches.
Oh, just here.
I haven't tried them.
Wonderful. One of Harriet's letters is profoundly revealing of how she sacrificed her personal friendships for loyalty to the York family. This is 1871. Dear Miss Rogers, if I say I was pleased to receive your letter, I should say what I did not feel. So often we've looked forward to the pleasure of your visit, but as often as we have looked, we have been disappointed. And for what reason? Because Miss Rogers had not the courage to ask Mrs. York for a week's leave. We've made up our minds that if you do not come and see us, we will never call again. So
I know, it's pretty strong.
Yes. Servants didn't get much time off, even senior servants, so perhaps there was an issue there with just the sheer amount of time she had, but...
Well, yes, they didn't have much time off, and if she had to do Mrs. York's hair every time she dined out or had people to dine.
He's berating her for not having the courage to ask Mrs. York, but presumably that's quite difficult at the time.
Well, I think it would be, yes.
Yours very sincerely, J.C. Maddox. Did she get lots of Valentines?
Quite a number, yes. It is amazing, though, that she kept all these Valentines, don't you think?
It is. They're just exquisite, aren't they? The way they're just... The work on these is just wonderful.
Yes, and this is quite a delicate one.
It's got little messages written in the folds.
And the name of the chappie at the very end. I think it was a Herbert somebody. I don't want to see anybody called Herbert.
Yeah, it's what this it says. Pray let us join both hearts in one.
Well,
sounds like it's quite serious.
Do you think it's a proposal?
Yes.
She was engaged 3 times, you know.
Right. She never married in the end?
No. I think she liked working for Mrs. York. She was very loyal.
Just the fact that she kept all these objects, formal photos of herself in uniform, a prayer book inscribed from Mrs. York, are a testimony to Harriet's loyalty. This is a really extraordinary collection. Paints such a vivid portrait of Harriet and her personality. And it seems to me that Harriet really preferred her life as the housekeeper in the big house. In many ways, Harriet stands as the ideal of the Victorian servant, which is selfless, quite religious, very proper, indispensable to her mistress, clearly really enjoying her work. But this came at quite some personal cost. It puts a strain on her friendships. She puts her Valentine's cards away. She turns down a few proposals of marriage. She stays single. And what this says to me is that servants like Harriet could and did make choices. But if they chose to remain in service, they really had to accept the limits of that life. Over the course of the 19th century, the starchly uniformed servants we are so familiar with today had become clearly defined and standardised. Through hierarchy, segregation, uniforms, and a strong sense of knowing your place, highly individual, talented people like William Taylor, housekeeper Mrs. Webster, and the maids of all work became just cogs in the machine of Victorian society. Being an ideal servant was ultimately about accepting your station in life. And this wasn't just an elite view, this was a view shared by many, many servants, especially the successful ones. And for me, it's that word station that's so revealing here. It implies that people have to somehow stand still, even though the world around them is changing very fast. And it's this ideal that was going to be seriously challenged and questioned by the next generation of servants. In the next episode, servants in the run-up to the First World War start to challenge their station in life, in private and public. And it doesn't go down well with the masters and mistresses.